¿Qué tal amigos? ¿Cómo están ustedes? Espero que estén excelente el día de hoy. Señores, en esta oportunidad les traigo una información importante sobre el presidente de Ucrania, Zelenskyy, que ha visitado los Estados Unidos para buscar más recursos y se devolvió con las manos vacías. Sí, señores, esto es serio. El presidente de la Cámara de Representantes de los Estados Unidos, Mike Johnson, se rehúsa a autorizar el request, la solicitud que ha dado o le ha impartido el presidente de los Estados Unidos, Joe Biden, de autorizar más fondos para Ucrania. Sí, señores, como están viendo en pantalla, Zelenskyy se reúne con contratistas de defensa en Washington, D.C. durante una licitación por dinero de los contribuyentes estadounidenses. El presidente ucraniano Volodymyr Zelenskyy se reunió con contratistas de defensa durante su visita a Washington, D.C. esta semana, en medio de una oferta de 61 mil millones de dólares en apoyo de los contribuyentes estadounidenses para Ucrania, según un video que publicó en las redes sociales. Pero ahora Zelenskyy se marcha con las manos vacías. Mitch McConnell admite que las conversaciones sobre la ayuda a Ucrania no van a ninguna parte y apuesta hasta enero. El presidente de Ucrania, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, se quedará con las manos vacías en su último recorrido por el Capitolio de los Estados Unidos. Las negociaciones sobre la ayuda estadounidense adicional a Ucrania, junto con un paquete de seguridad fronteriza, están muertas para el 2023, según se informa, dijo el líder de la minoría del Senado, Mitch McConnell, a sus compañeros republicanos del Senado en su almuerzo semanal el martes. Los comentarios del líder republicano se producen mientras Zelenskyy realiza su tercer viaje en un año por el Capitolio de los Estados Unidos con las manos extendidas. La oposición republicana a la ayuda adicional a Ucrania ha crecido constantemente a medida que los votantes se han opuesto a las súplicas de Zelenskyy de más donaciones de los contribuyentes estadounidenses. El Congreso ya ha autorizado más de 100 mil millones de dólares en ayuda a Ucrania. El martes temprano, Zelenskyy se reunió individualmente con el presidente Mike Johnson. Posteriormente, Mike Johnson reiteró su posición de que la Casa Blanca y el Senado deben tomarse en serio la seguridad de la frontera antes de que se pueda considerar cualquier ayuda adicional a Ucrania, argumentando que la administración Biden no ha logrado delinear objetivos claros para ayudar aún más la guerra de Ucrania contra Rusia. Como pueden ver aquí en pantalla, Andrew Dinero ha publicado lo siguiente. Mitch McConnell dijo a los republicanos del Senado durante el almuerzo que las conversaciones entre Ucrania y la frontera no van a ninguna parte este año y se pospondrán hasta enero, según los asistentes. Ahora, Benny Johnson ha publicado lo siguiente. Joe Biden dice a los periodistas en la Casa Blanca que se callen. Miren esto. Biden le dice a los periodistas, cállense un momento, que tengo una cosa que decir. Acabo de firmar un documento para entregarle a Ucrania 200 millones de dólares americanos, pero ya va, esos 200 millones de dólares americanos no serán enviados. Ya van a ver por qué.
Thank you. Thank you.
Porque, señores, ya van a ver, espérense un momento. RT en español dice, el embajador ruso en Estados Unidos califica de inútil el viaje de Zelenskyy a Washington. El viaje de Zelenskyy resultó ser inútil. No logró convencer a Washington de que Ucrania es más importante que la seguridad de Estados Unidos. Todos están cansados del limosnero de Kiev, declaró Anatoly Antonov en el canal de Telegram de la embajada rusa en Estados Unidos. Miren, señores, estas son las cosas, así son las cosas para Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Así está actualmente Zelenskyy con los Estados Unidos. Este es Israel, este es Estados Unidos y este es Zelenskyy. Miren esto. Miren esto. Zelenskyy le pide más ayuda a Estados Unidos y miren cómo le hace Estados Unidos a Zelenskyy. Así funciona la política. Ahora, ¿por qué los 200 millones de dólares que Joe Biden ha autorizado se van a retener? Miren esto. El presidente Mike Johnson rechazó el paquete de ayuda militar de 200 millones de dólares del presidente Biden para Ucrania. lo que llevó al presidente Zelenskyy a cancelar su reunión programada en el Congreso. Mike Johnson, el presidente de la Cámara de Representantes, dijo en los medios, ante los periodistas, que les voy a mostrar el video a continuación traducido en español, y él dice: nosotros mantenemos nuestra perspectiva de que Ucrania tiene que defenderse, pero primero tenemos que poner a Estados Unidos primero. Mike Johnson le ha pedido al presidente de los Estados Unidos y a varios congresistas que le entreguen cuál es la línea de ruta sobre ese dinero que quieren autorizar. ¿Cuál es la línea de ruta? ¿Será que con estos $200 millones Ucrania pondrá fin a la guerra con Rusia? Mike Johnson se pregunta, ¿cuál es la estrategia que se va a implementar aquí, que con este dinero que nosotros vamos a autorizar nos garantice que Ucrania cese la guerra con Vladimir Putin? Entonces, ¿cuáles fueron las respuestas? Que no lo saben, que no hay ninguna línea de ruta. Le pidió inclusive al presidente de Ucrania, Zelenskyy, cuáles son sus estrategias, cuál es la línea de ruta que él va a implementar con este dinero que sí se autoriza para poder cesar la guerra con Vladimir Putin. ¿Y saben lo que le dijo Zelenskyy? Que él no sabe, que simplemente ese dinero es para poder reforzar las tropas que están al frente contra Rusia. Eso es todo. Pero aún así, ellos no tienen planes contundentes para hacer una defensa de combatir y erradicar con este conflicto. Entonces, señores, básicamente este dinero que se quiere autorizar no tiene ningún propósito en específico. Ahora, quiero que vean este video. Miren.
Thank you all for being here. Just had a good meeting with President Zelenskyy. I reiterated to him that we stand with him and against Putin's brutal invasion. The American people stand for freedom, and they're on the right side of this fight. I have asked the White House since the day that I was handed the gavel as Speaker for clarity. We need a clear articulation of the strategy to allow Ukraine to win. And thus far, their responses have been insufficient. They have not provided us the clarity and the detail that we have requested over and over since literally 24 hours after I was handed the gavel as Speaker of the House. And so what the Biden administration seems to be asking for is billions of additional dollars with no appropriate oversight, no clear strategy to win, and none of the answers that I think the American people are owed. I have also made very clear from day one that our first condition on any national security supplemental spending package is about our own national security first. The border is an absolute catastrophe, and this is because of the policies of this White House and this administration. We had 12,000 illegal crossings on one day last week alone, on Wednesday. We have almost now 280 known terrorists that have been apprehended at the border. None of this counts the gotaways. If you add the numbers up, it's almost 7 million people who have been encountered at the border just since President Biden took office, and at least 2 million gotaways. This is twice the population of my state of Louisiana. Fentanyl is the leading cause of death for Americans age 18 to 49 in this country. Fentanyl poisoning because it's allowed over the border. We have human trafficking and all the other terrible things. In the last 3 months, October, November, December alone, we've had more illegal crossings at the border than in any entire year during the Obama administration. The American people see this, they feel it acutely, they see all the terrible societal ills that come from this, and it must be addressed. So I've made this very clear, again, from the very beginning, when I was handed the gavel. We needed clarity on what we're doing in Ukraine and how we'll have proper oversight of the spending of precious taxpayer dollars of the American citizens, and we needed a transformative change at the border. Thus far, we've gotten neither. The Senate has been MIA on this. The House passed H.R. 2 6 months ago, more than 6 months ago. It's been sitting and collecting dust on Chuck Schumer's desk. I have told him personally, I've told the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, that these are our conditions because these are the conditions of the American people. And we are resolute on that. It is not the House's issue right now. The issue is with the White House and the Senate. And I implore them to do their job because the time is urgent and we do want to do the right thing here. With that,
Ahora, les quiero mostrar a continuación donde este tipo dijo ante la prensa que si Estados Unidos no sigue suministrando dinero a Ucrania, Estados Unidos tiene el deber de enviar tropas a los jóvenes norteamericanos para defender a Ucrania entre ellos mismos. Si no hay dinero, tiene que haber militares estadounidenses. Miren esto.
The U.S. will have to send their sons and daughters exactly the same way as we are sending their sons and daughters to war. And they...
Zelenskyy dice, Estados Unidos, los hombres y mujeres tienen que ir al frente de esta batalla como nosotros estamos enviando hombres y mujeres a la batalla. Estados Unidos debería enviar a sus hombres y mujeres militantes a este conflicto también.
They will have to fight.
Y que tienen que luchar por nosotros.
Because it's NATO that we're talking about, and they will be
Y lo he dicho en la OTAN.
dying. God forbid, because it's a horrible thing.
Sí, señores, ¿qué quiere decir esto? Que Zelenskyy le está pidiendo a Estados Unidos que si nos sigue enviando dinero, entonces tiene que enviar sus tropas al frente de esta batalla. Miren esto. Elon Musk dijo lo siguiente: un ciudadano estadounidense está en prisión en Ucrania después de que enviamos más de $100 millones. ¿Hay algo más en esta historia que simplemente criticar a Zelenskyy? Si eso es todo, entonces tenemos un serio problema aquí. Miren esto. Última hora. Tucker Carlson confirma que el secretario de Defensa Lloyd Austin amenazó con enviar a sus tíos, primos e hijos a luchar contra Rusia, a menos que se envíe más dinero a Zelenskyy. La revelación se produce pocos días después de que el funcionario de la Casa Blanca, John Kirby, dijera que la sangre estadounidense será el coste de apoyar a Ucrania si dejamos de enviarle dinero. Su gobierno tiene una adicción y esa adicción es la guerra. Esto fue lo que dijo John Kirby.
And so we can't support Ukraine. Their chief advisor yesterday said they're likely to lose this war if they lose US support. And
John Kirby dice, si no podemos seguir apoyando económicamente a Zelenskyy, como me he reunido con el mandatario y ministro de Defensa de los Estados Unidos.
Putin gets all of Ukraine, then what? Then where does he go? Because right then, he's up against the eastern flank of NATO. And if you think the cost of supporting Ukraine is high now, just imagine how much higher it's going to be, not just in national treasure, but in American blood. If he starts going after one of our NATO allies, because as the president also said, we take our Article 5 commitments very seriously.
Él dice que la sangre estadounidense va a permanecer en la lucha con Ucrania si no se sigue enviando económicamente dinero a Zelenskyy. Estas fueron las palabras de John Kirby. Ahora, en el episodio 45 que les voy a mostrar a continuación de Tucker Carlson, lo ha publicado en las redes sociales, esto tiene relación con Ucrania y dice lo siguiente: ¿cómo podría Washington enviar decenas de miles de millones más a oligarcas de mala conducta y de mala calidad en Ucrania, ahora que toda la empresa ha resultado ser un desastre infructuoso, corrupto e increíblemente destructivo? Porque eso es lo que siempre va a hacer. Sí, señores, a continuación, Tucker Carlson ha entrevistado a nada más y nada menos que a Thomas Massie, donde se habla sobre este tema de Ucrania, qué va a pasar para el 2024 en esta situación de Ucrania contra Rusia, y si Vladimir Putin ganará más territorio, señores, de lo que se ha ganado actualmente. Quiero que vean este episodio y le presten atención a lo que dice Tucker Carlson y este republicano sobre el tema, un tema bastante importante y un tema bastante interesante que hay que tratar. Miren este video.
Ever notice how the bigger the tragedy is, the harder it is for the people responsible to apologize? If I rear-end your car and increase your bumper, I'm happy to jump out and say, I'm sorry, I can't believe I did that. But if I were to, say, invade Iraq under false pretenses and kill 1 million people and spend $1 trillion of your dollars doing it, I wouldn't say a word. I would never admit that was a bad idea. I couldn't. It implicates me too profoundly. The same goes for if I say, locked your kids inside for a year and destroyed their brains and prevented them from getting an education. Or if I say, forced you to take a vax that didn't work that very well might have hurt you. I could never admit that I did that. I just couldn't. Because if I admitted it, I'd have to suffer the consequences. Something very much like that is happening with the war in Ukraine, which has been in progress now for almost 2 years. We were told at the beginning that our support would allow Ukraine to beat Russia and keep Russia from invading the rest of Europe or something. Well, almost 2 years in, none of that has turned out to be true. Ukraine is not going to beat Russia. The only person who's been beaten in this is the United States. The U.S. is weaker, measurably weaker, because of our support for Ukraine in this war. That's just true. The verdict is in. And honest, rational people admit that, no matter what their previous position. But the Biden administration cannot admit that, and neither can the U.S. Congress. And so now there is, believe it or not, an effort in progress to get the U.S. government to send another $60-odd billion to the oligarchs in Ukraine. So another generation of Ukrainian men, this one probably in their 50s, can die in a pointless war on the battlefield. They're not going to win, but the U.S. Congress would like to keep this conflict going anyway. So you'd think someone would stand up and say, this is awful, but almost nobody has. Why? Because the position of the administration is, if you're not in favor of this, sending another $60 billion to the oligarchs in Ukraine, then you're working for Vladimir Putin. Watch the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, say that out loud.
I want to ask a question about Ukraine. Are you saying that any member of Congress who votes against aid to Ukraine is voting for Putin?
I believe that any member of Congress who does not support funding for Ukraine is voting for an outcome that will make it easier for Putin to prevail. That is, a vote against supporting Ukraine is a vote to improve Putin's strategic position. That's just an inescapable reality. That's not speaking to someone's motive, why they chose to vote against it. That's just speaking to the outcome of their vote. A vote against supplemental funding for Ukraine will hurt Ukraine and help Russia. It will hurt democracy and help dictators.
These people cannot see themselves. A lady in a mask, presumably not on her way to rob a liquor store, but wearing it for health reasons, asked the National Security Advisor about the moral implications of a vote in the Congress. And he says with a straight face, anyone who doesn't support this legislation is helping Putin. It's insanity. But it's intimidated almost the entirety of the U.S. Congress and certainly the Republican leadership, which is foursquare on the side of the Biden administration to continue this tragedy. There are very few members of Congress who dissent, and one of them who has done so consistently and in the most articulate possible way and on principle has been Congressman Thomas Massie of Kentucky, who we wanted to talk to about this and also to thank for his bravery and steadfastness. Congressman, thank you so much for coming on. I've got so many questions, but well, why don't you just tell us why you're not voting for this?
Well, we can't afford it. Look, at some point, I realized we had spent more in Ukraine than we spend on all our roads and bridges in the United States. And I tweeted that. And Newsweek did a fact check on me. And what they found out is it was true. And, when you get the fact checkers to admit that a conservative, when they give them a mostly true rating, it's a metaphysical certainty. And since then, we've spent twice as much in Ukraine as we do on all of our roads and bridges federally in the United States. That is money that could have gone to double our infrastructure. Yet we're blowing up infrastructure that we're going to end up, I hate this, but they're going to tell us that we have to rebuild it when this is all over with.
The scale of this insanity is hard to digest. And I think whatever empire comes after ours will spend time studying it, what not to do. But you got to wonder, why is the leadership of your party, the Republican Party, in favor of this? Why the new speaker, who seems like a nice guy, but also like a child? Why would his first act as speaker be to endorse this? I'm confused.
Well, I hope he doesn't. But, Biden's budget director, the head of the OMB, sent a letter yesterday to Speaker Mike Johnson, imploring him to spend more money in Ukraine. And what they said is they want to revitalize our defense industrial base. That's the new acronym, DIB, for the MIC, the Military Industrial Complex. And they sent a list of states that would get money when we spend, money on deadly munitions, because they have to be manufactured in Alabama or Ohio or Texas. And so, they're saying the quiet part out loud, that congressmen tend to vote for this stuff because a lot of this federal spending that goes to Ukraine is actually laundered back to the military industrial complex. And in some ways, not very efficiently, but in some ways, it enriches people in their districts and the stockholders, some of whom are congressmen.
That's also grotesque, but it's also straightforward. People are getting rich, so let's do it. Okay, that's an argument. It's an immoral argument, but it is one. But that's not the argument they're making in public. They're saying we have a moral obligation. You're a bad person. You just heard the National Security Advisor say that you're a bad person if you're against this. But no one ever mentions that we have abetted the killing of an entire generation of Ukrainian men that will not be replaced to fight a war that they cannot win. They literally cannot win. We prevented a peace deal and we extended the war and we killed all these people. And so all the ones running around with their little Ukraine flag pins, they're implicated in that. Has anyone apologized?
No, to support this money, you have to be economically illiterate and morally deficient. Those are both conditions of voting for this. Because to say that we're going to grind down Russia, that we're going to deplete their own soldiers by expending the lives of Ukrainians, knowing that in the end, we're going to leave them holding the bag, that in the end, they can never prevail. They're not going to take back Crimea, even though we say that's one of the goals, when we can get them to state goals, which usually they won't. So it's morally reprehensible to say that you should fund this. And by the way, he says I'm a friend of Putin because I won't vote for this money. Well, I would say that I'm a friend of Americans and I'm putting America first. But he's part of, I would say, Putin's reelection campaign, because Putin is a Cold War relic that was elected in response to our Cold War relic, which is NATO. By expanding NATO, the neocons and the liberals, every time they push NATO closer to Russia, they help people like Putin get elected.
It's, outside our borders, it's very obvious that the whole world is resetting and that American influence is in very rapid decline, thanks in large part to this war in Ukraine, and that Russia is now joining this coalition, which will be the majority of the world's population and economy and military strength aligned against us. So this is resetting the world to our disadvantage. Again, leave the country. It's obvious your first day that this is happening very fast. Does anyone in Washington see that?
No, there are very few. I've been voting against these resolutions in Ukraine and the money going to Ukraine since 2014. In 2014, we helped to overthrow their elected government. And we were saber rattling against Russia. And I said, listen, these sanctions and this saber rattling and these resolutions, they're going to have consequences. And they have had consequences. Almost nobody in Washington, D.C. will admit this through their voting record. Now, they know it, but they won't admit it and they won't vote that way.
Do you think it's strange that, maybe the single most consequential voice in this entire debate is a woman called Toria Nuland, who's the Undersecretary of State, who was a driving force behind the war in Iraq, which was, of course, a disaster and hurt the United States. She was never punished for that. In fact, she rose within the bureaucracy, and now she's running this war in Ukraine. And no one ever says her name. She's never held to account for all of this. She has far more influence on it than the entire United States Congress put together. How do we allow unelected lunatics like Toria Nuland, who clearly hates the United States and always has, to have this power over our lives and our children's future?
I don't know. I feel like some of these deep state bureaucrats, they're like the kids who had no friends in high school. And somebody did something bad to them long ago. And now they've got some power and they realize how to grab it. And they're going to have retribution on everybody else. Victoria Nuland was at a classified briefing to all members of Congress just a few weeks ago. And I thought, and this was on Israel. And I thought, wait, she's failed multiple times. Why are you dragging her out she has no credibility. Why are you having her brief Congress right now?
I mean, she's responsible or shares responsibility in the deaths of more people around the world than maybe any other living American. And yet she's in a classified briefing? I mean, I'm not saying she should be in prison, though you could certainly make a case for that. But she certainly should not have a security clearance and be briefing members of Congress. Did anybody say, wait a second, there's nobody more discredited than you are, Toria Nuland? Did anyone say that?
Nobody did. By the way, these classified briefings, they're basically propaganda spoon-fed to members of Congress directly from the deep state and from the administration. So we're going to have one today, in fact, on Ukraine. We will all file into an auditorium and leave our cell phones at the door. And we're just, I'm sure this is going to be sort of a psyop or struggle session to get us to vote for more money to go to Ukraine.
I don't understand why the co-equal branch of government, the legislative branch, the Congress, allows itself to be manipulated by the intel agencies and the National Security Council. It seems like really crazy and masochistic even.
Well, listen, a lot of this money, too, isn't just going to lethal aid anymore. We're propping up the government. We're paying salaries of politicians in Ukraine, and we're paying pensions of politicians in Ukraine. Yesterday, I met with the Special Inspector General over Afghanistan, and I found out we've spent $6 billion there since we left. There's still money going to Afghanistan. And he said, you know, you really need, he doesn't want the job, but he said, you really need a special inspector general over Ukraine. And I said, what do you think, where could they be hiding some of this money, or where could it be going? And he said, well, look at what they did in Afghanistan. 30 or 40% of the the police in Afghanistan, their security forces, didn't exist. We were paying salaries for people who were on the payroll, but they weren't real people. And now that we're paying salaries in Ukraine, how do we know that those are real people? As a matter of fact, we saw with the PPP program in the United States, people were getting money to pay people that weren't even on their payroll. So there are lots of obvious places to look for waste, fraud, and abuse. I wouldn't be funding it to start with. But if we are going to fund it, we need to have somebody auditing this.
It's such a humiliating way to end the American empire, such a self-destructive way. I don't think people fully understand just how deep in the hole we are. I noticed that on your blazer, you've got some kind of device, which I think tells us the answer. Can you explain it?
Yeah, so, I went to MIT, I'm an electrical engineer, and I wondered how I could use my degree here in Congress. And I decided to build a debt clock that I could wear all the time. I wear it on the floor, I wear it in every hearing. And the design goal was to induce anxiety. We have congressmen and senators who have pacemakers. I thought they needed their heart shouldn't be normal. It should be skipping beats and arrhythmic. So I built this to induce that anxiety. It's working pretty well so far. In fact, some congressmen, they vote, they put their voting card in, they press yay to spend the money, and then they look at my lapel to see if it's immediate enough to show the impact of their vote. But really, we need more people to be concerned about the debt. The interest on this is now going to overtake all of our military spending. We'll soon be paying more for interest on the debt than we do for our entire military.
So that's another word for that is bankruptcy. It can't, because these are math questions, It can't continue indefinitely. In fact, I think we can see the end of it on the horizon. Is anyone afraid?
No, I don't think so. I think the only way we're going to get any kind of austerity or reality in our spending is when the people who loan us the money quit loaning it to us.
Right.
And what we'll go into is a spiral there. Like we did during COVID, we printed $5 trillion, created it out of thin air, and borrowed it from ourselves to make it look legitimate, filtered it through the banks so they could get some of the money too. And that's why we have inflation. I'm sorry, it's that simple. Again, you have to be economically illiterate. If you think that throwing another $5 trillion into the money supply isn't going to cause inflation, that's what we have. It's long lasting. Now, the Fed was supposed to be the firefighter, but they're really the arsonist, and they're coming in and they're raising interest rates. And they've raised them to the point where it's going to be hard to, buy a car or move into a house.
So I don't think you'll make us feel better when you answer this question, but is Ukraine funding, this will become law, I assume.
I don't see any way to stop it. There is some discussion here in Congress about tying it to security on our border. The problem is, I think if you give Biden more money for the border, he'll just process more illegal so-called refugees into the United States quicker. There is talk about limiting it to just lethal aid and telling Europe that you've got to prop up the government of Ukraine, but I doubt that'll happen. There may try to tie some strings to it, but I think the money is going to go through anyway, and I'm worried about that. It's just going to, again, what Biden has asked for, $60 billion. That's how much we spend federally on all roads and bridges in a year in this country.
I have to ask you an unrelated question. I don't know if you're prepared for it or not. But so the military has a problem with recruitment, and the military said pretty clearly we don't want any more white men who fought all of our wars, but we don't want any more of them. And then drove a lot of people out with the COVID requirements, with the mandates. Now we have tens of millions of military-age foreign nationals here illegally. There have been calls in the Congress for those people to join the military to fill the gap. So you could wind up with a military filled with people who are not Americans and have no loyalty to this country or knowledge of American history or affinity for the culture. And then you're Rome, and then you collapse. Do you think that you will hear more calls in the Congress to solve the recruitment crisis with illegal aliens?
I think you will, and I think it's a horrible idea. And you characterized the vaccine mandate correctly. That was a purge. That was an ideological purge of our military. It was a loyalty test to a liberal agenda. It's sort of like taking the sacrament in the religion of COVID. And if you wouldn't take the sacrament, then you had to, leave the military. And now they're dealing with that. A lot of good people were forced out. I mean, pilots who had millions of dollars of training, special operators, and it's sad now that, like you said, we're bringing in people with a different loyalty or no loyalty at all if those senators get their way.
It's absolutely terrifying. Last question, a topic that most people aren't thinking about. I certainly don't understand, but I know you're focused on it, so that's probably important. And that's meat. And you've got a piece of legislation that will address what you think is a problem with the way the U.S. government regulates meat. Will you tell us what it is?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a bill called the Prime Act, and it's in response to the fact that 85% of the meat that's served in the United States is processed by one of four meat packers, and one of them's owned by China, one of them's owned by Brazil. So there's this monopoly on the meat industry, and the irony is farmers can't sell directly to consumers in their own counties and their own states. They have to ship these things across the country, and it's affecting the nutrition of our food, the safety of our food. So what my bill says is if the farmer and the consumer and the local processor are all in the same state, if there's no interstate commerce involved, then get the feds out of it. Yes. And I've got some good news to report. We're making some progress on the Prime Act. I may get some portion of it in the Farm Bill. I've been fighting for this for 5 or 6 years, ever since they got rid of country of origin labeling on meat in the United States. I realized that this was something that I needed to get done. So we're working on it. We got good success, and even working across the aisle. I've got Democrats who are helping to sponsor this. In fact, the main sponsor in the Senate, you may be able to guess this, is Angus King. He actually sounds like a beef offering at one of the local fast food places this week.
It does, actually. Foreign control of our food supply is a bad idea, and I hope everyone recognizes that. I mean, come on. Congressman,
look, this would be in the Bill of Rights if it weren't so obvious.
Well, that's exactly right. It ought to be. It's great to see you. Thank you for your bravery and the clarity of your positions, and I hope people listen to you. Thomas Massey of Kentucky. Thanks.
Ahora bien, lo más importante de todo esto. Vamos a compartir este video, señores, a través de las redes sociales. Vamos a compartirlo por WhatsApp, por Facebook, por Instagram, por Telegram, por X, por Truth Social. Porque las personas merecen saber la verdad y merecen saber este tipo de información. Entonces, si tienes a un familiar o un amigo o una persona cercana, inclusive un vecino, un amigo, compártele este video en las redes, compártele este video, no cuesta nada. Adicional a esto, regálame un gran like como forma de apoyo a este canal, suscríbete, muy importante, suscríbete, activa la campanita para que la plataforma te notifique cuando suba un nuevo video. Nos vemos, señores, en unas horas con un próximo video importante para todos ustedes como tanto se lo merecen. Hasta luego.